Parks are vital meeting places, a lifeline for many during the current pandemic. But what can be done about the unprecedented levels of litter in parks? That's the question we'll be examining today in the Leeds Big Litter Debate, organised and hosted by Love Leeds Parks. I'm Dr. Anna Barker, an Associate Professor in Criminal Justice and Criminology at the University of Leeds, and I'll be chairing the debate. Litter, it's costly to clean up, a hazard for the environment and dangerous to wildlife. For communities, it affects the use and enjoyment of green space, perceptions of safety, and a sense of how well a park is cared for. Keeping parks clean and tidy are often a top priority in visitor surveys. Joining us to look at why the problem of litter escalated as lockdown eased and what practical steps can be taken to reduce it are Richard McIlwain, Deputy Chief Director of Keep Britain Tidy, Isabel Smith, Senior Parks Estate Manager at Leeds City Council Parks and Countryside Service, Martin Child, Friends of Roundhay Park, and Rob Greenland, Co-Director of Zero Waste Leeds. I'd like to extend a very warm welcome to our speakers and thank you all for agreeing to contribute your views on this topical and significant issue. Before I outline the format of the event, I want to hand over to Hannah Coyle to introduce Love Leeds Parks. Over to you, Hannah.
Hello, I'm Hannah Coyle, Fundraising Officer for Love Leeds Parks. Love Leeds Parks is a partnership organisation which supports community-led enhancements to public parks and green spaces in Leeds. Our partners include Leeds Parks and Green Spaces Forum, Leeds City Council's Parks and Countryside Service, and Leeds Community Foundation. We have an annual grants programme called the Leeds Parks Fund, and last year we were able to give out grants to 13 projects, which included the restoration of a heavily silted pond, tree planting to promote biodiversity, and strengthening riverbanks to mitigate the risk of flooding. Earlier this year, we launched a campaign to enable people to give a little back for the many benefits they've derived from their local green space in recent months. Donations made to our Give a Little Back campaign will support this year's iteration of the Leeds Parks Fund. If you would like to make a donation, please go to our website, which is loveleedsparks.org.uk, and click the donate link, which will take you to our Virgin Money Giving page. The Love Leeds Parks Festival formed part of our Give a Little Back campaign and took place online and in parks in August. The Leeds Big Litter Debate was originally intended to form part of Discussion Wednesday, which was one of the themed days of activities during the festival. As we received so much feedback about litter from park users during the festival, we decided to reschedule the event and gather more thoughts, questions and solutions. And thank you to everybody who fulfilled our request for comments. Your input to this event is much appreciated.
Thank you, Hannah. So just moving on, in terms of format, we'll begin with 5-minute presentations from each of our speakers, followed by a panel discussion on the many solutions and questions we received by members of the public, community groups and friends groups. So while the focus today is on litter in Leeds Parks, we could be talking about the situation facing many parks in towns and cities across the UK. Our first speaker is Richard McIlwain, who's been leading Keep Britain Tidy's summer campaign and the Great British September Clean. Speaking from a national perspective, Richard will give an insight into the scale of the litter problem, why it got worse during lockdown, and the aims of these campaigns. Over to you, Richard.
Hey, good morning, everybody. Delighted to be here, delighted to be representing the nation's anti-litter charity, Keep Britain Tidy. We've been around since 1954 as an organisation. The Women's Institute set us up as a charity since the 60s, so we've got a wealth of experience on this issue. And I think just to set some context to begin with on litter, litter's been an issue, obviously, as you'll be aware, for many, many years, although clearly has hit the media this summer. We have undertaken a national litter survey every year since 2001. And what that shows is that litter levels kind of stayed stubbornly static. And if you want to know the top 4 litter items that we find, it's quite straightforward. Cigarette litter always comes in at number 1 because cigarette butts are small and they're everywhere. Chocolate, sweet wrappers, confectionery wrappers, number 2. Soft drinks, bottles and containers, cans, plastic bottles, number 3. Fast food packaging, number 4, and then the list goes on and on and on. But really, they're the big 4 if you were to focus efforts. Now, litter is a massive problem nationally. We know this. It costs local authorities around £700 million every year on street cleansing. That's just in England alone. The RSPCA get around over 7,000 calls every year about animals, domestic pets and wildlife injured by litter. And more deprived areas tend to be more heavily littered, sometimes up to 7 times more heavily littered than wealthier areas. So I'm always keen to say litter is much more than the aesthetics of a crisp packet making the place look untidy. It costs us a fortune, harms wildlife, and is a matter of social justice because poor people live in littered, untidy, unkept areas on the whole. In 2019, we undertook a survey where we actually counted litter. So our surveyors went out across 3,000 sites and counted individually 75,000 different litter items. Perhaps unsurprisingly, 2/3 of those were cigarette butts, cigarette filters. But when you look at it by volume, which is the size of the individual item of litter, what you find is that 3/4 of it is drinks containers and bottles, which some of you will know there's an interesting debate around deposit return schemes, and government are actually scheduled to bring one in 2023. So, we are huge advocates for that. So really, if you're looking to tackle litter, cigarette and the packaging associated with our food on the go culture is where you've got to target. Now, what happened in lockdown in the summer? When we were in lockdown earlier in this year, actually littering levels declined. We had lots of our supporters telling us places were much cleaner. Fly tipping went through the roof because lots of us were furloughed. We were doing our DIY. The recycling centres were shut. Also, perfect storm. We hired a man with a van who then went and fly tipped it. Post lockdown, we've seen an epidemic of littering, I think it's fair to say. Bournemouth Beach obviously trended on Twitter, I think twice, but we manage the Green Flag Award scheme for parks, the National UK Parks Award programme. So we're in contact with lots of parks managers, and they were saying on the whole it was the worst they'd ever seen. We had one parks manager say he'd been in post for 30 years and he had never seen scenes like it. On average, local authorities were clearing an extra 57 tonnes of litter from their local authority as a result of what we saw post-lockdown. It was costing anything up to £150,000 extra for individual local authorities at a time when a lot are near bankruptcy. And so it sort of gives a scale of what we were finding. It's not just parks, it was in national parks, it was in the Lake District, it was on beaches, but parks particularly. And what we were told was it was actually what they were finding was a significant minority, and it was also younger people. So, and what we're thinking at Keep It Tidy was there's a psychology when we come out of lockdown. A lot of young people won't have experienced that before and they just wanted some freedom, but also the festival culture or the Magaluf culture, because a lot of people would be abroad on holiday or at festivals, just transferred into parks. So it wasn't just litter you were finding, it was barbecues, it was pop-up tents, it was deck chairs, it was the dreaded nitrous oxide cylinders, which have become a feature of our landscape now, the small silver containers. And so we developed a Summer Parks campaign, which was very much focused on a positive campaign. It wasn't berating people. It used images of people who used the park or worked in parks, and it asked people to be part of the solution and to care for the park. And we're analysing the results of that now. It ran in Roundhay Park and it ran in parks around the country. And also now we're in the thick of our Great British September Clean. We had to postpone earlier in March. We're running we had nearly 700,000 people sign up across the UK to take part in March. We're not going to get that many people in September because we've got the rule of 6. We're limited on numbers, but it's really important. That campaign is really important. And I'm going to finish now, because while there's a significant minority of people who litter, there's a significant majority of people who care enough to give up their time to go and litter pick. And we need to get those stories in the media that people care, because cleaner places actually stay cleaner, and it keeps government and business focused on the issue of 500,000 people, 500,000 voters, 500,000 consumers are passionate about this issue. And at that point, I'll finish, and I'm very happy to take part in the debate afterwards.
Thank you so much, Richard, for that really, really informative and concise introduction to all of those issues there. Our next speaker is Isabel Smith, who manages some of the city's major park estates, including Middleton Park, Golden Acre Park and Roundhay Park. Isabel will discuss the problem of litter facing these parks, how litter is tackled in Leeds, and provide early insights from the Keep Britain Tidy campaign in Roundhay Park. Over to you, Isabel.
Thanks, Hannah. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Yeah, just thought it might be useful by starting to share with you the approach that we do take here in Leeds to dealing with the litter, and then perhaps go on a little bit more to talk about the challenges of dealing with the litter in Leeds Parks, and in particular Roundhay Park, as we participated, as Richard just said, in the Keep Britain Tidy campaign. I'll talk about the impact COVID's had on us here at Roundhay Park and the approach that we're actually trying to adopt to excuse me, to tackle this. So the general approach to dealing with littering in Leeds is, as it states here on the slide, education, engagement and encouragement. So we do very much focus on behavioural change, and the reason for this, and again, as Richard sort of discussed slightly, is that it's based on the national research, the insight, pointing to this being the right approach for us to adopt. We want to sort of maintain that focus on, responsible behaviour and nudging people to sort of do the right thing. Citywide, but not including the parks, it's actually the council's cleaner neighbourhoods team that deal with a wide range of environmental issues, dealing with sort of waste that's deposited in gardens, fly tipping. I'm still on the last slide. I'll let you know when I move on. Fly tipping and litter. The work, similar to us in parks, focuses on education and awareness raising, and the impact that has on the city from an environmental, social and financial perspective. Sort of the Cleaner Neighbourhoods service, much like any other across the authority, are stretched, and it's really only as a last resort, and in areas where there's really high incidences of waste-related crime that we'd use enforcement and look at issuing fixed penalty notices. As you're probably aware, enforcement is notoriously difficult, and as a general rule, you'll have to catch a perpetrator in the act, which can be really difficult. So instead, the approach is very much about working with partners, Zero Waste Leeds, Clean Leeds, the police, Safer Leeds, and in particular with schools, certainly at primary school age, so we can sort of encourage that positive behaviour from a real grassroots level. Next slide, please. Just thought it might be worthwhile, for those that don't know, a little bit about Roundhay Park, and I suppose it might put it in context the scale of the challenges that we get just from this particular park alone. We're about 4 miles out of the city centre, so we attract a lot of visitors. We have 700 acres of parkland that we manage. This includes lakes, woodland, we have specialist gardens, there's 2 playgrounds, a skate park, tennis courts, allotments, football pitches, an outdoor gym, and we've also got 2 cafes on the site here, along with Tropical World Zoo, so it's massive. We're really lucky that we've got sort of our active and really supportive friends group, and you'll hear from Martin next. But we also have other key user groups on Roundhay Park, including sort of the allotment holders, the cricket teams, the rowing and canoe clubs, and park runs. So we get about 9 million visits a year to this park alone. So, unsurprisingly, our peak period tends to fall around school holidays, and in particular the summer months, which of course coincide with COVID. Next slide, please. I do think it goes without saying that, with the recent restrictions have demonstrated how important the parks and green spaces have been for physical activity for people, but beyond that, for their mental health and well-being. And I think even as the restrictions are continuing to relax for other sectors, parks are still very much a focal point for where people want to meet. So we're definitely seeing larger numbers of people come in. We take great pride in our parks in Leeds, and whilst most people do act responsibly, we've got an awful lot that don't. So we have experienced a huge amount of increase in littering and social behaviour. And whilst our staff here and the community groups do an amazing job at trying to sort of deal with this, the warm weather that we got and we experienced just meant that we were absolutely overwhelmed with visitors. So whilst the issues that you're looking at on the slide here aren't uncommon and are things that we sort of struggled with before COVID, and regardless of COVID, they've definitely worsened since the lockdown period. So we're getting daily incidences. We're also, during COVID, suffering with a significant reduction of staff, and I think for the majority of the period, we were operating at a 33% reduction in staff. It was 50% at one point, and gradually back down to about 20% in July and August. So we are still very much dealing with, that recovery period. We're still not out of it. Slide 5, please. Next slide. I think prior to COVID, the park was cleared of litter. and you know, we did that daily. We struggled after COVID to maintain the standard that we would like to have achieved, and we've focused all our efforts, literally all the staff have been pulling them away from their normal duties to focus on litter collection. So, you know, the authority still facing huge challenges, and still got a responsibility to protect those most in need. We really wanted to focus on that message about people acting responsibly, so everyone can continue to enjoy the parks, and resources can be actually focused where they're needed. So at the start of lockdown, we actually started some work on an awareness raising campaign. So this was prior to the Keep Litter Tidy campaign, and that was very much about that personal social responsibility to litter, and taking care of sort of your local park. We did get support from local media outlets, social media, and really the message was very much focused about take your litter home with you. We were getting, you know, incurring huge disposal costs and staff time, and really needing, you know, some further support, which meant the timing of getting involved with the Keep Litter Tidy campaign was just perfect for us. I'll quickly come through the next few slides, which are about the actual staff intervention, because Richard has talked a lot about what the campaign was. But we did submit an expression of interest. We were successful in that, and we've run the campaign through sort of the end of July and throughout August. There was a great deal of sort of national press coverage, and kick-started the campaign with some social media activity and sort of other channels like posters and bin stickers and banners across the park. The intervention, as Richard said, is about behavioural change, personalisation, making the messages relevant to park users to evoke that better response and elicit the better response. If you move on to the next slide, these are just sort of some of the campaign artwork. This is just a little bit of an idea of what you would see when you came to the park. So it was sort of narrowed down to the messages were narrowed down to the specific parts messages. And the next slide, and I'll finish off here, is that, you know, we have been monitoring the campaign over that period, and we'll be feeding into the report that Richard mentioned. We've also looked at the tonnage data and the waste collected compared to the baseline figure that we had before lockdown, and then in the early months of lockdown. What we do know is in Roundhay Park alone, so just the Roundhay Park, that we collected about 12 tonnes of litter in August alone. So that was just for that one park. So we'll be looking at other measures and evaluating the campaign and feeding into the national analysis. And based on the levels of success, we'll determine if this is an approach that we ought to roll out citywide. Thank you. Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for the perspective on Leeds and your insights into the campaign at Roundhay. Wow, 12 tonnes of litter in one park. Our next speaker is Martin Child, who is Friends of Roundhay Park's coordinator of the litter group. Martin will give a volunteer's perspective on why litter picking is needed and what volunteers get out of taking part. So over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Anna. Thank you for the invitation to take part in this event. I mean, a lot of what I've got to say really has been covered. I made a big mistake a couple of years ago at one of the Friends of Roundhay Park meetings. Volunteered to take on this role. Didn't quite know what I was letting myself in for. We already had a very well developed litter picking scheme within Friends of Roundhay Park, and a very good band of enthusiastic volunteers. But I don't think I'm a particularly naive person, but I was surprised at how bad things were. And we're going back a couple of years or more now. And all the sort of types of litter that Richard talked about earlier were exactly what we were coming across. And as things have moved on over the last year or so, and then coronavirus came in and all the lockdown, we experienced that fantastic weather and a reduction in litter. Initially, lockdown started to lift, and it was staggering. I have to say, it was appalling. It's been fantastic for recruitment to litter picking because we have recruited quite a significant number of extra people. But the type of litter we were dealing with was, again, what's been spoken about before. And it was on one of Isabel's slides, and there are other things that are, you know, filled babies' nappies, dog poo bags that are full, and not a shortage of these. These aren't rare occurrences. So some fairly noxious, toxic waste, really, as well as the bottles, the plastic bottles, the glass bottles. More glass bottles, incidentally. We're seeing more and more glass bottles, which are harder to get rid of because they're just heavier. We have a fantastic band of volunteers. They are the most enthusiastic people you would wish to meet. They have been going out doing sort of guerrilla litter picks during lockdown, individually and in pairs. It's very hard to know how much we collect because of this being done sort of under the radar as well as our formal sessions. But I calculate over 500 bags a year, and I think probably significantly over that. This is we think that we can, in our own relatively small way, support the fantastic park staff who, again, as Isabel said, with the people shielding and people self-isolating, they've struggled. And I think in our small way, we've been able to support the work they've been doing. But I don't want to keep on about the unpleasantness of it, but this isn't just a casual dropping of a few bits of paper. This is much more significant, very much more significant. And we tend to talk about antisocial behaviour. We are trying to engage with schools. We've got some work. I'm hoping we're going to pick up again next year with some local schools. I've had meetings with local schools much earlier this year, and of course all that ground to a halt. But we would like to take part in the education side of this as well. And a lot of our volunteers are very keen to do that. And just talking about what the volunteers achieve, there is a huge sense of satisfaction. I have to say there is a huge sense of satisfaction. That is coupled with a level of frustration and irritation when you go back 2 days later and it's nearly as bad as it was when you started. But we do think just by keeping the place as much as we can tidier, it helps set an example. It may be harder, I'm not sure, it may be harder to drop litter on a clean field than one that's already fairly, shall we say, contaminated. But at the moment, I think that's all I need to say, because some of the things that other people have said, I'd just be repeating it really. But thank you.
Martin, thank you so much for those insights. It's really, really useful to get your perspective, but also for all of your efforts and supporting the litter collection and park staff. Obviously, Isabel's mentioned there the reduction in park staff over this period of time and how important that is. Okay, our last speaker is Rob Greenland from Zero Waste Leeds, who will speak to the issue of waste and its impact on the environment and how individuals can contribute to combating this problem. Over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. Yeah, and hello everybody, and thanks for having us today. If we've got my slides, if we go on to the next slide, please. And if we go on to the next one as well, please. Yeah, thank you. So yeah, I'm from Zero Waste Leeds. We're a Leeds-based social enterprise, and we're doing what it says there on the slide. We're looking to kind of build a movement to help Leeds become a zero waste city by 2030. And the movement bit matters to us because it is about lots of different people getting involved in lots of different ways to help us reduce waste. We'll go on to the next slide, please. What I wanted to reference and talk about today really was a project we've been involved in Leeds for the last couple of years, Leeds by Example. And that's been particularly kind of focused on the city centre and looking at how we can make it easier for people to recycle whilst they're out and about. So, I mean, I think this is particularly relevant. You know, it's already come up. A lot of the litter that we see is, you know, what you would call kind of on the go kind of packaging. You know, things like, you know, bottles and cans and food wrappers and that kind of thing. So, although parks are a quite different environment, I think a lot of the waste that we kind of see is, you know, will be quite similar. If we go on to the next slide, please. And as I say, we're kind of recognising that there is a massive kind of issue in terms of the amount of waste that the things that we consume and the things we throw away, and we focused, as I say, particularly on Leeds. And then next slide, please. And the main thing we did was we had about 85 new bins in the city centre, the orange ones for coffee cups, the yellow ones for plastic and cans. And we were trying to make it as easy as possible for people to recycle when they were kind of on the go. And then, as you can see on the next slide as well, we worked quite a lot with retailers as well to make it easier for people to take things like coffee cups back to the retailers so they could take the packaging back to source. And then next slide, please. And then I suppose the other bit that I think is important to talk about is a marketing campaign that was behind the project. So we did a lot of work to kind of engage local people kind of across the city centre. And then next slide, please. We also did quite a lot of work around kind of what you might call social norms. So to kind of get across the idea that there are people in Leeds who are, who are recycling. And on to the next slide, please. And we picked real people for that campaign. You know, these are traders at Leeds Market, for example, for the campaign. So that's kind of the background in terms of where we're coming from. I mean, in terms of, I certainly don't have answers, but I've got kind of reflections from some of the stuff that we explored in the campaign that hopefully useful here. I mean, my first reflection is, I suppose, a kind of challenge really to say I'm not sure there will ever be enough bins. You know what I mean? I'm not sure more bins is necessarily the answer. There's around 4,000 public bins apparently in Leeds, you know, and I'm not sure how many will ever be enough. So I think, you know, I'm keen to explore with people a bit more if they think that, you know, around the kind of the bins issue. Having said that, though, I think the placement of bins matters. So again, we found in city centres, you know, if we put them obviously next to some of the sources of the waste, sometimes at places where people are kind of lingering at traffic lights or whatever it might be, waiting to cross the road, you know, putting bins there kind of helps. And then kind of identifying hotspots where there is, you know, there is more litter is clearly something that is important. I think there's probably something from Leeds by example to learn in terms of the recycling focus. Again, I think as has already been mentioned, really, a lot of what is litter in parks will be recyclable. And I think, you know, in most situations, we don't have recycling bins in parks, and it'd be interesting to explore if that was a possibility. I think as has already come up that, you know, there could be issues in terms of contamination of the bins from other things that people are throwing away. But I think recycling might be one of the things to kind of look at. And then, as I said, there's a lesson as well for us in terms of the, you know, bins matter, but also the engagement with people. You know, we put a lot of time into engaging people on the issues why it matters to recycle, for example, which is why I think the kind of summer campaign that's been running is really interesting, and I'm keen to see if we can kind of build on that. And ultimately, I mean, if we look at the image we've got on screen there, I mean, a marketeer would talk about changing social norms, and I think what we're trying to do is to make it more normal that if you've brought stuff with you, you take it back home with you. You know, you don't necessarily expect that there'll always be a bin that is ready to and there to take your kind of litter. And I suppose that's kind of my kind of final point really about seeing this as part of a bigger picture. In that I do think, you know, clearly bins matter, but it's a much bigger thing than this. And again, I think this is why the campaign over the summer is quite interesting. If you can get people, if you can tap into that sense of pride people have about their park, if you can change the social norms about people thinking, well, actually, I should probably just take these things home rather than leaving it toppled on top of a bin that's already kind of full to the brim. You know, I think that they're the kind of things that will make a difference, but they are long-term changes, and I think, you know, that, you know, I'm not pretending they're not kind of a challenge. So yeah, so I'd be keen to keep exploring that in the chat in terms of what we learned in Leeds by example. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rob. It's really useful to get your perspective on the broader things that are also happening across Leeds. So much appreciated. So thank you all for your wonderfully informative and concise introductions to this issue, which I think sets some of the groundwork for us to take forward into our panel discussion. which I want to open up to all of you, and which focuses on the, as I said, the many responses and questions and possible solutions, some of which you've mentioned in your talk so far, about that we got from the public and from friends groups and community groups about what those solutions are. Most of the solutions that we got submitted to us kind of fell within 4 categories. More bins, and as you've mentioned there already, Rob, the placement of those bins for ease and convenience for people to use. More park staff, particularly around education, encouragement, but also around kind of visible deterrence, and also the idea that if we've got more staff, actually more staff with powers, that you use those and enforce on-the-spot fines. Another common solution was around more volunteers, more liquor picking groups, and finally the kind of 4th category being around more education and engagement to instill those anti-littering values and social norms. So you've also had a chance to have a look at those comments that we received, and so what we're going to do for the next part, if it's okay with you all, is to talk through each of those categories and have an open debate about them. And I've asked you each to kind of take a lead on one of those. So just let's start with more bins, which is where we kind of left off with you, Rob. Yep. This was a typical solution identified by many people to us. One individual said, the overflowing bins show that some are doing their best to put litter in bins. More bins are needed. Some types of bins are inappropriate, as such items like pizza boxes are too large. Larger, cheaper and more uncomplicated bins are needed. You've already identified some of your issues around there, and you indeed had bins in some of your pictures there. So are more bins the solution?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really good question, and it's great to see so many people were kind of interested in a topic that is much, it takes up much of my life at the moment. But I mean, I think, as I've said already, really, I'm not quite sure when there will ever be enough bins. Do you know what I mean? There's at least, the 4,000 bins across Leeds. I was in Park Square in the city centre recently, quite a small green space. I think there's 16 bins in that small space, and I'm just not convinced that more bins will be the thing, because I think there will be always plenty of people who think that's still too far for me to walk to put something in the bin. I mean, I think, as I suggested, I think placement of bins is clearly something to look at. Again, we've done quite a bit of work on that with Leeds by Example, looking at where to put the recycling bins. It's not particularly rocket science, but it's about thinking about how to, where the sources of the waste are. I think other kind of points that have come up kind of already in the discussion, I think the design of bins matters. I think there's probably something that we could kind of play about with in parks a little bit. I think someone mentioned about, bins that look more attractive, maybe look like, shaped like an animal, or a fun for children to put some waste in. I think that's certainly worth kind of exploring. I think the kind of messaging on the bins matters as well. So, again, I think that's why the campaign over the summer is really interesting. And can we have some messaging on the bins that, first of all, tells people what to put in them, but maybe also there's messaging about why it matters to put you to recycle, or whatever it might kind of be. And then kind of final point is that I think there are some technology kind of answers here as well. We've got these smart belly bins in the city centre that can take more waste, but also let people know who are there to empty the bins when they're kind of full. So yeah, in summary, I think clearly bins have got an important role, but I'm not convinced that more of them would solve the problem.
Richard, go on, interject. Thank you, Rob.
Sorry, I just unmute myself. Yeah, in many cases, I do agree with Rob. We get this quite a lot. I keep it tidy, people saying, there's not enough bins, and my answer is always, well, how many bins do you want? Do you want a bin every 10 yards? Because actually the research we've done often shows that if people have to walk more than 10 and 20 yards, it can sometimes be a bit too far. Very much a first world problem, I know, but that's the reality that we face. The other thing with more bins is, of course, it might cost 300 quid for the bin and a little bit of cost to install it. That's not the capital cost is not the issue. It's the revenue cost of then having to service that bin on a collection round. And I talked about local authorities spending every year £700 million on street cleansing alone. I mean, that's the equivalent of over 30,000 nurses' salaries, to put it in context. So all we do is just continue to increase that cost. I do absolutely agree with Rob that actually, arguably, less bins, better located in hotspot areas and consistently designed. Because what happens over time, you get a plethora of different designs of bins. So if you have a consistent format, people get used to it. One other important thing is that sometimes bins can actually attract littering. So when they're full, people start to litter all the way around the bin rather than thinking, I'll take it home. So I'm not necessarily an advocate for more bins. I'm definitely an advocate for bins, but well designed. Big belly bins, yeah, absolutely have a place. They're quite expensive, and I think you wouldn't necessarily have them everywhere. But I guess in summary, I kind of echo what Rob is saying, in that more bins, I don't believe is the answer.
Thanks. So fewer, better placed bins. Isabel, any thoughts, or Martin?
I have a comment really in support of what both Richard and Rob have said. I suspect design of bins could be better, maybe capacity increases without making them too unwieldy, too empty. I completely take on board. I mean, we get this a lot. We get a lot of people just seeing what we're doing and saying, the problem in this park is there aren't enough bins. And I'm sure Richard and Rob will get this all the time. I'm sure Isabel does. I don't think this is the answer. I think it may be short term, better placed, better designed bins. I would really love some sort of element of recycling within Roundhay Park and probably other parks as well. That would be great. But I think what we've got to do is reduce the volume. I mean, bearing in mind what we experience as volunteers, huge quantities of litter. I mean, people have been going into the park having picnics. You can see the outline when they've taken the blanket away, and it's outlined with everything, huge quantities of stuff. And they've walked maybe 10 or 20 or 30 yards to the car. They brought the stuff in the car, unloaded it, had their picnic, picked the blankets up and got in the car and went away. So I think more bins wouldn't necessarily help in that situation. But I do think we've really, really got to push. And this is a sort of, I was going to say long term, I'd like to think medium term objective. Recycling is important, but I'm by a month or two, I'm the oldest person on this panel, I think, probably more like 10 or 12 years. I remember the deposit bottles, and kids would collect the bottles and take them back to the shop and get a deposit back. It was a good way of supplementing your pocket money. And I think we should be doing the same. I mean, there are schemes, I think in Norway, they have one where you just take the plastic bottles, feed it into a machine, and it gives you a ticket, which you can spend in the shop. I think the incidence of plastic bottles dumped in the park would absolutely dramatically drop, or not completely disappear, but it would go right down if that system was in place. So I think lots of good bins is important now, but I think we need to be looking much more intelligently in the future. How we tackle the things like the less pleasant things like the nappies, I think this is education and education, involving children and teenagers and leading by example. People often say, I mean, we did a freedom of information request to find out how many people have been prosecuted in the Roundhay area for litter picking in the last few years, and basically nobody. But I have to encourage our volunteers not to tackle people, because sadly at the moment, if you tackle somebody that you see has dropped litter, you might and probably will get a level of abuse or worse. Things are not quite as safe as they may have been a few years ago. So I think there's that side of it. And for park staff, the beleaguered park staff, to take on that responsibility is a lot. And a lot of these people that work in the park, they're now spending a disproportionately large amount of their time emptying bins, not doing some of the other things they should be doing, perhaps, or what would prefer to be doing.
Ending on that park staff comment, Isabel, 4,000 bins in Leeds. Do we need more? What's your perspective?
I suppose very much like others have commented is, you know, installing more bins. How many bins exactly is it going to take? I mean, Roundhay Park alone has 104 bins, you know, that's an awful lot of bins for us to be emptying on a daily basis. You know, we are actually installing some more bins over the coming weeks. I think you're right. It's about strategically placing those in particular sort of hotspot areas. So, you know, that is work that is being done. And as Richard sort of points out, you know, the cost and the installation of the bin, whilst it's quite expensive, you know, you're looking at sort of £400-500 in some instances. It's not so much that initial outlay, it's that ongoing cost, and I'm redirecting my staff's efforts from, you know, actually the upkeep of the park and the upkeep of that green space, and that's been redirected into litter collection. Well, why is that okay when that is somebody else's litter? It is their responsibility. You know, that I feel much like other people on the panel, this has got to come back to some form of education and people taking personal responsibility for their own waste. You wouldn't do it on your own doorstep, would you? So why go out to a place that's actually offered you some great salvation over the last sort of few months in particular? Why go do that, you know, at any point? Take it home with you.
Thank you, Isabel. Right, we've got 3 more solutions to debate, so I'm going to move on. So another possible solution that was identified was more voluntary people doing more litter picks. One community litter pick group commented to us, when footfall increased at the start of lockdown, the volunteers started to increase litter picking and bin emptying from 1 to 2 to 3 times a week. They found this successful with no increased litter. Martin, that speaks to kind of a couple of your comments there. If there's a clean field, do people litter? Secondly, some of those responses about more litter picking also speak to another comment that you raised also, is can we tie this to incentives? So, and the creation of deposit return schemes, allowing those who do pick it up or don't discard it in the first place to make money or tickets from returning litter. What's your views? And then we'll open it up to the panel.
Well, I think there are some interesting points there. I mean, recruiting people to litter pick isn't that easy. So to actually increase the number very significantly might be quite a challenge. There is always the argument that the last thing we want to do, and let me be, I'm speaking very personally here, not necessarily on behalf of Friends of Roundhay Park, by the way, but I'm conscious we mustn't be seen as taking jobs from people, and that matters to me. We have been accused of that, and I don't want to get into that. But I think there is the slight danger. You've just said that that doesn't appear to be happening in that case. But the more that we do, to some people, the more acceptable it is. Well, we can leave it behind because those volunteers come out and clean it. And I don't want to encourage that. I would actually like to make us all, although we're all, well, most of us are retired, I'd like to make our job redundant. I'd like to think we don't need to do litter picking. I suspect that's an ambition that will never be achieved. However, I think we need to look, as I said, at more things like recycling. The very fact that litter pickers could take the stuff and get the deposits and benefit themselves, I don't think that would sit well with our group. But I have to face the fact we live in it might be the biggest park in the country. However, it is situated in a very affluent part of Leeds, so that the sort of people that we've got are not the sort of people that are needing the money and would probably feel uncomfortable to take any benefit from it. However, I can see other things that could come from that. Perhaps that money could be used for the benefit, not personally, but for the charity or for other charities. But it also possibly could be opened up to people who are rather more disadvantaged and could benefit from it. So I think there's things that may be worth thinking about there. But I would really, really like to look at ways of actually reducing the volume of this stuff.
Thank you. Thank you, Martin. Over to you, Richard. Oh, you need to unmute yourself.
come on.
Yeah.
Oh, you're muted again.
There, I'm in. Sorry, the number of times I've done that over the last few months is unbearable. Sorry about that. So just to clarify on the deposit return scheme, just so that we're clear, government it's in the Environment Bill, which is going through Parliament. The primary legislation to introduce a deposit return scheme is in that bill and is currently scheduled to come in by 2023. So if that timetable is adhered to, we will have a deposit return scheme in 2023 for drinks containers, plastic bottles, aluminium cans and glass bottles of all sizes. What we think that will mean, although the level of deposit has yet to be set, is the deposit will be set at around 20 pence, which is the deposit which has been set in Scotland, who are slightly ahead of us on this. They are legally now bound to introduce a scheme by 2022 with a flat rate deposit of 20p. I've been to Oslo to see the way that the Norway scheme operates. The RS schemes operate in 40 countries around the world. Lithuania have just introduced theirs a couple of years ago. You know, we're a bit behind the curve here. But what the evidence shows, if it's implemented well and designed well, it makes a massive difference. You know, it's 20 pence, it's your 20 pence you're getting back and redeeming. So there's no shame in returning the bottle. And actually, what you get is some really interesting innovations. Like in Copenhagen, they design park bins with hoops around the outside. So if you don't want to return somewhere to return the bottle, rather than throwing it in the bin where it'll probably go for incineration, you pop it in the hoop and somebody else can collect it and take it. You know, COVID-19 to one side, and we will be past COVID-19 at some point. So I just wanted to be clear on it. That is coming in, and that will make a massive difference. The other thing I think is we are always keen to advocate that litter picking is a massively positive contribution. We hear the things keeping people out of a job, but the reality is I think it's very powerful for people to be seen in a community caring for that community in a positive way.
I agree with that, absolutely, yeah.
Because it pushes back, you know, people think about the selfish behaviour of minority, but cared for places, research demonstrates cared for places tend to stay cleaner. To your point, Martin, I think you made earlier, cleaner places do stay clean. It's broken windows theory, if anybody's heard of that. If places look untidy and uncared for, people think it's okay to tacitly behave badly. If they look cared for and it looks like people's looking after it, people tend to behave better. And that's my feedback to that, to what Martin said, but yeah.
Thank you. Anyone else want to come in there before we move on?
Yeah, I mean, just very briefly, just to build on what's been said, I think it is that, I think litter picking by local friends groups builds on that sense of local pride. Do you know what I mean? And I think it's one of those things that over time can change kind of people's behaviour, that we see that there are other people who care enough about this place to go out in their spare time to look after it. So I think it's clearly an important part of what needs to be done.
Thank you. Okay, I'd like to move on to a really common solution that was identified: more education and engagement, often starting early with children so that they would develop anti-littering values that extend into adulthood. One individual commented, typically, "It's important to capture children's understanding of the litter problem. I grew up with the Take Your Litter Home message, which still resonates strongly with me today." Indeed, as a child, I remember doing litter picks myself, getting sweets for the amount of litter I picked. So Richard, is more education and engagement the solution, and is starting young the answer?
It's not the solution. There is no the solution, but it's a vital part of the overall solution. If we think of the solution being like a jigsaw puzzle with lots of different components needed. We run a program called Eco Schools in England. We've got about 20,000 schools engaged. It's a broad environmental program, but one of the key elements in that, as you'd expect, is litter. And I think the most important part when you come to education is to make it action-based learning. So the piece that was the person you referred to there about going out and doing a litter pick and getting a reward, you need, our experience is you need to combine classroom lessons about the broader impacts of litter. So harm to wildlife, harm to pets, harm to marine animals, the things that the RSPCA have to deal with, but then take children outside on a litter pick and have them experience what they're seeing, collect it, count it, sort it, which are the most commonly done. Really engage them in the issue will, I think, can make a difference. I always, my eldest daughter hates me for this, but I always use the story about how when she was in secondary school, she came home raving about they'd done a piece in class about sustainable clothing, about conditions for workers in Southeast Asia, about something really engaging. What a big issue. And then went up to Primark on Saturday and bought a load of clothes. Now, you know, Primark aren't the worst out there, I'm sure. But so I said to her, what aspect of all that wonderful education you had translated into changed behaviour? It didn't. So we've got to be really, really careful when we talk about education, that it's education for the purposes of changing behaviour. And there is a big gap. We all talk about Blue Planet effect, and then we talk about what we witnessed post-lockdown this year. So there's a huge gap between greater awareness and education and changed behaviour. And you've got to be very clear when you talk about education that what you're trying to do is not just create more aware people, but to create people whose behaviour has changed as a result.
Thank you. Anyone else can I invite to come in there?
Can I just say that we have worked with 1 or 2 schools, and I agree with Richard, actually getting children out literally into the field and doing it themselves. That cannot be beaten. And if the schools are engaging, and I think we are pushing at a little bit of an open door now more than perhaps a few years ago, probably because of the Blue Planet effect to some extent, and some of the things that are happening in the world as we speak now. And some of our political leaders are causing an increase in debate because of their approach. So I think in a way, this is a very good time to do this and to be engaging. We have little Friends of Roundhay Park within our organisation. We do organise litter picks for the very smallest children. Whether that's a little bit too early, I don't know. Whether it's ever too early, I don't know. But I do remember as a child getting in trouble from my mum because I could not drop litter. So when she went through the pockets of my school blazer, she knew exactly how many sweets I'd eaten, and it was always too many. But that was because of that you don't drop litter, the training I had as a child from my. It's not just schools, it has to come from parents as well. And if the parents don't think dropping litter is a problem, then the children won't. So I think it's a very holistic thing that we need to look at here.
Absolutely. My own child, I have a 6-year-old and has just had an environment project at school. Now heard about the dangers of litter to hedgehogs and got an award because he immediately then started a litter pick group in his school grounds, and subsequently won't use plastic straws in any place we go. So it's a thumbs up from me. Anything else on education and engagement that you've potentially learned, Isabel, from your work in Leeds Parks?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what people have been discussing and what they've been saying, and absolutely think that education is at the heart of the solution. I think, and Martin sort of touched on it there, it's sort of about that reinforcement from other positive places and where people take their influence from. And I think that's easier in certain areas of the city and certain parts of the country where, there aren't those higher areas of, deprivation, because those people that are living in the areas that have got higher incidences and dealing with higher sort of like crime rates around sort of waste and other things, are also dealing with, multiple other issues. And I suppose that, thinking about recycling and thinking about, cleaning the streets and keeping the areas safe and tidy, it sort of perhaps comes secondary to a lot of other pertinent issues that those people are perhaps dealing with. So, I appreciate there's a lot of research and insight that goes into this, and it's I suppose it's tapping into what that motivation is for those people. And a bit like Richard said, it's just not, it's not one approach, it's a combination of different things: consultation, education, that service infrastructure and the changes to that, some form of enforcement to reinforce those messages, all have to sort of work together to sort of elicit sort of the results that we're wanting to see. I think, people understanding that it's their responsibility. There's a lot of work and effort has to go into that, and whilst it's important that we do that in school and we do that through that educational route and we go in at the sort of the grassroots, it's beyond that. It's got to be reinforced in other settings that those young people are entering.
Thank you, Isabel. Really important point. Where do we take our influence from, and how do we build in education? I'm conscious of time, and I want to talk about the one final category that was a commonly mentioned by the public who responded to our call for comments. And that was the introduction of more park staff. Isabel, you've already mentioned that park staff obviously suffered a reduction under COVID. The idea here is that that there might be more staff and potentially designated litter wardens with powers of on-the-spot fines. One individual said, in Sydney, no one drops litter because there's huge fines for doing so. We need park wardens on bikes giving on-the-spot fines. So Isabel, starting with you, do we need more park staff to engage, encourage and fine people?
I mean, I suppose it links quite nicely to the conversation we were just having there around education as opposed to enforcement as a way forward. I guess also it's quite timely that the financial impact of COVID on the local authority here in Leeds was announced yesterday, and sort of the next financial year that we're sort of funding a massive gap somewhere in the region of about 118 million. So I don't necessarily feel that it's as simple as a solution of, you know, employ more park staff, employ more staff, and paying more staff to pick up litter, and paying for those resources that actually under the current circumstances should be and could be better realigned elsewhere. I suppose the reality is that we're spending millions and millions of pounds on picking up people's rubbish, and if you continue as a society to accept that, then we'll continue to spend millions and millions of pounds on picking up people's rubbish. And I very much believe that, you know, it has got to be around that behavioural change, that education, and asking people to take responsibility for themselves. I simply don't think it can continue in that vein, and putting the responsibility back on park staff to deal with people's rubbish. You know, we have focused some enforcement efforts in, and this isn't my particular area. This is the Cleaner Neighbourhoods team that lead on this. But you know, we have employed a company in the city centre that do sort of, you know, where they've seen perpetrators in the act, they do issue FPMs for instances of litter dropping. But I suppose, you know, it's quite a high, you know, footfall area. You know, the need and the demand there was higher than perhaps, as Martin says, as to where we are in Roundhay Park, where it's a more affluent sort of area. So I do maintain that sort of position around education, awareness, you know, raising that social norm approach.
So enforcement as a last resort. Richard, over to you.
Yeah, absolutely. I would agree. We're advocates for good enforcement, consistent enforcement and proportionate enforcement, so that you keep people on side. But it's not the ultimate solution. It's like the conversation we had before about bins. Are you going to put an enforcement officer on every street corner? Because I could go around the back of my house now and drop litter and know that nobody's going to see me. So how far do you go? The reality is we do need a stick, and you need to target enforcement at known hotspot areas. Then you need to publicise stuff in the media, fixed penalty notices being issued, and enforcement is happening, because it is part of behaviour change. But the reality is, when you come right upstream of the solution, if we're looking to really make inroads into this over the next 3, 5, 10 years, we've got to look right at the top and say we're over consuming, there's too much packaging, we need to tackle our single-use culture. So we need to have less rubbish to carry around in the first place, would be my argument. And then actually we need to incentivize people. So whether that's a deposit return scheme for bottles, so you're incentivized to take it back and not litter it, whether it's a charge for taking a paper cup when you take your coffee instead of having a reusable cup, so you're incentivized not to take that paper cup. For me personally, they're the things that will start to make a massive difference. Getting rid or tackling our single-use culture, because that's, as I opened up by saying, cigarette litter and packaging from food on the go. If I can get rid of those off our litter, I will tackle 80 to 90% of the litter on our streets. And that won't be done, or you'd spend an awful lot of money putting lots of bins, servicing bins, fining people, And I think whilst it's important, I think we're better trying to solve the upstream end of the problem rather than focus an awful lot of attention running around, picking it up and finding people.
Thank you. May I invite some final comments on that matter? So on the matter of poor park staff enforcement?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's also kind of a practical issue in terms, sometimes in the city centre. I mean, instinctively I'm against the enforcement, but I can see that it could work in certain places. But I think a lot of the issue in parks is people sitting down somewhere, having a picnic or whatever it might be, and then leaving. And I just think practically, as I think someone said before, the idea that you'd have staff who are kind of observing people, and then the moment that they leave, they pounce on them to fine them for leaving the litter. I'm not quite sure that that's the kind of society I want to be part of, and I'm just not sure practically it would work.
I think that sorry, Anna. I think that I agree with everybody else broadly. I know that we are constantly approached that why aren't people being fined? But I think the practical difficulties are huge, and I tend to think back to the old, well, they used to overlook Roundhay Park, but Jimmy Savile, the clunk click, I know we should have the sort of seatbelt thing. Yes, there were heavy fines for not wearing seatbelts. So there was a carrot and stick approach. But in actual fact, it's really considered to be quite antisocial not to wear a seatbelt. Very, very few people don't now, because the knock-on effect just to the health service if you don't wear a seatbelt can be quite dramatic. So I think we really have to work in we have to encourage and demonstrate the right way to do things, perhaps more. But if there was a magic bullet, if there was a way that you could make people think, actually, there is a risk of getting a fairly hefty fine, that might not be a bad thing. But I'd love to think of a way of doing it. I know in the centre of Leeds, this company, I don't think Leeds pay the company. I think they generate their own income. But then I think that you're open to, it's a private company trying to generate money, so they might be a little bit lax in the way they enforce what they're doing. I feel uncomfortable about this, like some other people, I think.
I think just one comment on that, if I may. That the seatbelt idea example is really interesting, because I would tend now to put my seatbelt on, A, because it's become a habit, and B, because I don't want to go through the windscreen, rather than I worry about being fined. And for instance, I often use the example of driving while using your mobile phone. You know, you can now get 6 points on your license and a few £100s of fine. I can drive around every day and see people driving on while using the mobile phones. So, you know, harsher penalties, more enforcement, it all costs money, and it's definitely part of the solution. I'm not saying we don't advocate enforcement, we absolutely do, targeted in the right place, just like bins, and then communicated to say people are being fined, so that, because that's the awareness. It's no good doing it if you're not going to tell anybody. But to focus on only that as a solution, like more bins, more enforcement, I think is the wrong way around. It's actually, yes, some of that, but close that down, but actually focusing on how we've arrived at this huge single-use culture we've got.
Thank you all. You've been a fantastic panel. Now to close the debate, because I'm conscious of time, I'd like to invite each speaker to have either one word answer or a very, very short sentence, what you would like to see in terms of your next steps to reduce litter in the next 6 months or so. It's a multifaceted problem, but it sounds like a multifaceted answer and set of solutions to it. So if I can invite you to a one-word answer or one very short sentence. So I'm going to start with you, Richard.
Next 6 months, I would like to see the Environment Bill become an act, and I would like to see deposit return scheme come in. I would like to see producers made more responsible for the packaging they put on the market, so they reduce the amount of packaging. And I'd like to see us properly incentivised through charges to not always take things like paper cups, but to encourage more refillables and reusables.
Thank you. Rob?
Yeah, I'd be keen to learn from and build upon the campaign that's been running in Roundhay Park during the summer. I thought that was really interesting. I think it gives something for us to, to hopefully kind of build on longer term.
Thank you. Isabel?
Yeah, I'd love to see the campaign sort of deployed to other parts of the city. I'm really keen to see the results of it, and would love to see people taking their litter home so I can get my staff working back on making our parks and green spaces beautiful again.
Thank you. And Martin.
Well, it's easy for me now coming at the end. I would like to second and endorse everything everybody else has just said, and a personal ambition, as soon as we can get coronavirus under control, I would like to start engaging with local schools and get back to where we were a year ago.
Thank you. You've been an absolutely fantastic panel of speakers. I'd like to thank you, and thank you for Love Leeds Parks for hosting this debate. Many thanks. It's bye from me and a bye from all of us.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.